Residential schools. What legacy do they hold in Canadian history, and why do we still review it today? Over the last few years, I've noticed an increasing amount of ignorance and lack of awareness towards the younger generation when it comes to being educated about residential schools. Some common complaints I've heard are, why do I have to learn this? It's not like I did it. It's not like my ancestors did it. And, yeah, but why do we have to constantly be reminded about it? The truth is, we've only ever seen major cultural genocides a few times in the past century. The two that come to my mind are the cultural and literal genocide of the Jewish people in Germany and most recently, the attempted cultural genocide of the Indigenous people in Canada. Today, I'll specifically focus on a case I've read from the book Indigenous Rights by Chelsea Vowell, referencing mostly from chapter 20, Monster. Bang! Right from the jump on page 1, we see numbers demonstrating the sheer amount of destruction that resulted from residential schools. 150 years! For context, that's almost the same as the average of 2 lifetimes in America. Depending on what age a child was taken, they could potentially spend around 10 years in the huge, hungry monster. I'm going to highlight a few stats that I deem to be quite absurd and heartbreaking. Around 150,000 children attended, which in comparison is slightly more than the population of Coquitlam, BC. It's gut-wrenching to think that almost an entire city worth of children were stripped away from their parents and forcibly confined in quote-unquote hell. At least 6,000 children died in the system, with likely more to be discovered. The Catholic Church was responsible for running 67% of the schools with their policies and actions seemingly contradicting the teachings of Catholic principles, with the remaining percentage spread out between the United, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches. The last school eventually closed in 1996, marking 150 years of atrocities in Canada, which in contrast was less than 30 years ago, not ancient history like some perceive it to be. Survivors of residential schools were often too traumatized to speak about their experiences. The pain of having to recite their memories kept the stories hidden away. Not only till recently did survivors begin to open up. The more survivors began to break the silence, the more encouragement was given to other survivors who had been too fearful to speak. The effects of residential schools spread from generation to generation, and was felt by those who didn't even attend. A term used in the book to describe it was a historic trauma transmission, inferring that the trauma could be passed through generations. According to some studies, modern research shows that trauma can indeed be passed through generations via genetics. This addresses the complaints that say Indigenous people no longer face challenges in modern society, because yes, they do. Based on the development of human morality over the past few decades, we can conclude that another atrocity like this will likely never occur again. However, to ensure this, we need to acknowledge the history. Like what led to it happening? What was it like? How did it end? These are the things that our education system has attempted to address through a revamped curriculum. There has been a strong push for reconciliation over the last few years. But what do the Indigenous people truly want? It isn't money or funding, which I believe is a debt we owe for the destruction of much of their lands. But instead, it's simply just acceptance and awareness. What can be done to create a real change? What better way is there to create a change, if not through education? Enlightening the younger generations gives us cause to believe that they can live in a forever respect and appreciation of Indigenous peoples. To simplify, the reason why I believe the education system, particularly in BC, implements Indigenous studies is to address the perception that Indigenous peoples no longer face challenges and promote ways to create change. Another reason why I believe the education system is the most practical means of reviewing the legacy of residential schools is because it is the most efficient way of educating. Residential schools serve as a cornerstone for reconciliation, social justice, and cultural preservation efforts. The younger generation rarely reads the morning paper, watches the news, or does self-research on these topics. Instilling these topics in everyday school efficiently gets the message across.
Residential schools have created intergenerational trauma that had to be addressed through education. Whether we choose to support the mandatory decision or not, we cannot deny the legacy and horrific history of residential schools. It is our choice. Do we wish to contribute to an effort to reconcile and amend the broken bonds of our past, or do we choose to do nothing, stay silent, and ignore the appalling past that dwells within our nation?
The promotion of reconciliation through education helps the healing process. It also shows a commitment to justice. The younger generation is our future. Educating them now will help build a secure and inclusive society, free of the prejudices of yesterday. As Nelson Mandela once said, in the end, reconciliation is a spiritual process, which requires more than just a legal framework. It has to happen in hearts and minds of people.